Well, to begin with, economics succeeds only by not explaining capitalism. And here, the radical point that I'm making is that it is one thing to fail, it's quite another to succeed in your own discipline by ensuring that your own discipline is irrelevant vis-a-vis its subject matter, which is capitalism. It's a very radical claim, and I know that, and it's one that really annoys most of my colleagues in the economics profession. In medicine, for instance, we know that for many, many years, centuries, doctors were doing more harm than good. But that was not because that's what they wanted. It's not because they benefited professionally by killing more patients than they cured. It was a learning process. At some point, when was it, 1900, 1910, doctors started curing more people than they killed. And they became useful through accumulated, knowledge. In economics, this is impossible because as long as economics or economists are in the business of creating quantitative models which are meant as abstractions of capitalism, such that once you have them, you convince yourself that you've understood the architecture of capitalism. As long as that's what economics do, economics would only succeed in building these models if these models are dangerously irrelevant to capitalism. So effectively, they make themselves blind and deaf to capitalism in order to complete their models as models of capitalism. That's my radical denunciation of economics. Now, I love economics because, it's like the Copernican system, right? The Ptolemaic system. The Ptolemaic system, it was a beautiful system. It was wrong, but it was still beautiful. I'm perfectly capable of understanding the aesthetic value of a general equilibrium theory, right? But if you really want to understand capitalism, you have to set general equilibrium models aside in the same way that the Ptolemaic system needs to be ignored if you're going to understand the cosmos. So your question was, how do I understand capitalism? Yep. Well, capitalism, for me, is defined by two markets. The market for labor, right? And the market for finance, for credit. It is the only economic system in history where the process of work was regulated through a very weird market, the labor market. The reason why the labor market is weird is because it's the only market in which the buyer doesn't care at all about what he's buying. So, an employer buys time. They buy 40 hours a week of your time, let's say, 8 hours a day for 5 days, whatever, however many hours is specified by law, right? So they buy that time of yours, but they don't care about that time. What they care about is your work, is the amount of value you input into commodities, goods and services, right? But that they cannot buy. That is, a human creativity process which can never be contracted. There's no way you can write down in a contract, okay, that which comprises the creative power of labor. So the employer buys labor time, hoping to extract creative labor, productive labor during that time. And the extent to which the commodity has value depends on how much creative labor has gone into it, okay? Not how much time, because, you know, I can be employed for 8 hours a day and do nothing, stare at the wall, right? So unlike every other commodity whose buying and selling is fully specified by a contract, okay? You can say, you know, so many iPhones. I'm going to buy 1,000 iPhones for you for this price. That's a quantity. The moment you sign that contract, the exchange is finished and it's no longer economically interesting. You know what there is to know. So much money, so many iPhones. End of story. Okay? And there is no reason to have a human relationship between the buyer and the seller. I mean, they may have a human relationship. You know, you go to a marketplace, you say, okay, how much for the potatoes? €3. Okay. You don't need to have a human relationship beyond that. You can have it. You can have a discussion about the weather or football or politics, right? But it is irrelevant to the economic transaction. Whereas in the labor market, the moment you sign the contract, that's when the fun begins. Because then, you know, once you say, okay, I will be going to be working for you for 40 hours a week, right? That's when, you know, you enter the business, the factory, the shop, the architectural design studio, whatever, as an employee. And that's when the economically interesting part of the relation begins. But that is not a market anymore. You exit the market to get into that. So this is a very weird market. It is a market where what is being sold is not what is being bought. And therefore you have this twin nature of labor. Now that is unique to capitalism. It was not the case under feudalism, right? In feudalism, you were a peasant. You worked the land. At the end of the day or the season, you know, the Lord came around and collected, you know, 60% of the produce. End of story. There was no market. You were not selling anything. You were not buying anything. Okay, the relationship between the Lord and the peasant was a political relationship, a military relationship, right? You know, they would leave you enough so that you do not rebel and cut their heads off. But this is not something that economics has anything, you know, or markets have anything to do with. So, you know, the labor market. Now, there's a second market, which is equally weird, because the moment you, this surplus value, the difference between the creative labor and the value of the creative labor and the value of the labor time, this difference is surplus value from which profits, rents, interest emerges. The moment that becomes accumulated and ends up in the financial sphere, right, then it has to be invested. And usually those who own it do not invest it themselves. They give it to a financial investor to invest for them, a banker, you know, an agent, a broker. And that's when the financial investor will have to write a contract, which is again weird, because there's no way of specifying in advance how much money the investor will make on behalf of the owner of that surplus value. So the financial market, the market for money, and the labor market, these two weird and strange markets that are the source of all instability in capitalism and exploitation and bubbles and crisis, these two markets are what define capitalism and make it distinct from every other form of social organization, socioeconomic organization.